I'm very excited to present this week's teaching assistant, Darcy, who's right behind me. He came out of the ceiling after a week. Yeah, we had to destroy part of the wall to get him out, and he's very grumpy about being forced out into the open. But yeah, he'll be this week's teaching assistant until he goes to a proper foster home that's not going to lose him in a wall next week. Okay, let's get started with this week's lecture, where we'll look at some of the theories that underlie social work practice. So we can't talk about theory without talking about Bell Hooks, who unfortunately passed away at the age of 69 in 2021. She was a Black feminist activist, author, and scholar whose work really informed social work theory. As she writes, I came to the theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory a location for healing. So what exactly is theory? The formal definition is that theory is a generalized set of ideas that describe and explain our knowledge of the world in an organized way. Really, it's just how we make sense of the world. It's very much explained by the child's propensity to ask, but why? That's exactly what theory does. Try to answer all those but why questions. And that's why it's helpful to view children as theorists who, through their exploration and understanding of the world around them, engage in a sort of wondering estrangement because they're not familiar. Everything is quite strange and new to them. So they're an excellent mirror we can use to look at the world in new ways. So why does theory matter? Because it can influence how we view the world. We're acting based on theory, whether we acknowledge it or not. And there's a sense of urgency related to theory, as illustrated by Bell Hooks. It's her way of surviving. The textbooks also introduces you to Antonio Gramsci, who was in prison for the last 11 years of his life due to his arguments against the capitalist system. And for him, theory and the very aspect of living was defined by his statement, to live is to resist. And he really built on that idea of theory as a survival skill. He tried to understand, why do people take such part in the capitalist society, given the fact that the lower classes are very much used by capitalist society and oppressed by it, yet they still participate actively in it as if they are equal players in the game, as opposed to the pawns used by someone else. One of the ways that such theory is developed is through what's known as the grounded theory method, where instead of the top-down approach where theory is imposed upon a set of experiences, it's the experiences and the conversations with people that result in the building of a theory through continuous dialogue and checking of the shared understanding of what has happened. So theory is very much linked to both oppression and liberation. It's a form of oppression in that it can pathologize behavior. For instance, Patricia Deegan, as mentioned in the textbook, has a great documentary on the politics of memory. And she looks at how mental health and disability was pathologized, basically, and made into a medical condition that justified the segregation and imprisonment of a large percentage of the population into asylums. There's also the broken window theory. This was developed in criminology originally, and it states that visible signs of crime encourage antisocial behavior and civil disobedience. Therefore, if we police more where there's visible signs of crime and specifically target those visible signs of crime, such as broken windows, vandalism, etc., we can prevent more severe crimes, such as assaults and homicides. As you can guess, the broken windows theory, when it was tested within large cities such as New York or New Mexico, it very much focused on specific neighborhoods and completely ignored the fact that neighborhoods looking nice and the lack of crime is related to class, not to the criminal propensity of the inhabitants. So it further criminalized people of color in particular. And I have included a terrific video in this week's Canvas page that I strongly encourage you to watch to look at how the broken windows theory directly contributed to the policies that have resulted in the deaths of so many Black men by arbitrary arrest policies that were brought into effect as a result of the broken windows theory. At the other end of the spectrum, theory can also act as a form of liberation. For instance, critical race theory can start helping us to recognize and acknowledge the deeply entrenched racism within American society and start to deconstruct the prevalent dialogues and come to a new understanding of how society can and should be. We also have to really understand that theories are very much socially constructed. So our ideas about the social world are shaped by our experiences, right? So the type of theory that is developed is going to be very much contextual on your positionality. So with the broken windows theory developed by criminologists, the focus was very much on the crime, as opposed to the wider recognition of structural poverty and the fact that a broken window doesn't necessarily signal crime, it just indicates lack of money to fix a window. Another example is disability. So originally disability was seen in ancient times as spirit possession, or that the individual had done something immoral to deserve this God-given disability, which later moved into the medical model perspective, where the disability was used as something that had to be fixed. And then much later, we've got the social model, where a disability is not a person's whole self, it's just an aspect of their life, and really it's up to a society to remove barriers to access as opposed to try and fix disabilities. As you go through your placements in your work, try and consider some of the theories that underpin your placements and that determine the type of practice that's used. How are those theories developed? Who put them in place? Whose needs do they address? It's very important to reflect on our positionality and the standpoint that we come from, because there's risks involved in making a universal theoretical assumption based on research that provides only a partial view of human experience, right? We can't generalize to everybody from studies we make with white college students taking an intro to a psychology class, which is how many of the tools that we use in practice were developed, such as the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, the depression inventory. All of those were initially developed by testing them on white college students in the US. So they capture a very particular voice and view. They're not necessarily encompassing the whole of human experience. So consider what is at stake when other people who are the object of theorizing are in an unequal power position versus the theorist. It's very important to contextualize and problematize how theories are developed and how they are employed within social work practice. And we do that by thinking through some of these questions. So we engage in critical reflexivity and we think about, what contextual aspects or forces does the theory address? How congruent is the theory with the values and ethics of social work practice? Does it support or promote the values? Or does it support and promote values very much against what social work is about? Is the theory historically situated? Does it recognize intergenerational trauma, for instance? Does it look to redistribute power relationship and transform society? Or is it very much with a singular focus? Let's look now at a few of the theories that are most prevalent within social work, and next week we'll cover some more. The first one is the medical model. This has been, unfortunately, one of the most prevalent. The problem with it is that it's actually a range of theoretical and therapeutic approaches. Focus is always on problems and symptoms and deficits of the individual, with the treatment aimed at the individual without any recognition of the broader social, political, and economic contexts of that individual. So here's a graphic that illustrates this point. The medical model, when it sees a person in a wheelchair in front of a set of stairs, looks at the person's disability as the problem, and that the person should be figure out a way for her to walk, as opposed to the social model, which looks at it's the stairs that are the problem. We need a ramp here. Next, we've got the systems perspective, and we've already looked at this briefly in previous weeks when we talked about the ecological model. So this is very much in the same vein, where we look at individuals as complex living systems which are impacted within a broader systemic context. It emphasizes the reciprocal relationships between individuals, groups, and communities and their wider system. The problem with the systems perspective, though, is that often the focus is on achieving equilibrium, so a balance of some sort. And the problem with that is that it can be interpreted as maintaining the status quo, which is not great in a lot of situations. It's not exactly in line with the social justice model of social work practice. To address that, we've got the structural model, which very much focuses on the socioeconomic and political effects of oppression and inequality, particularly as they relate to neoliberalism and capitalism. And it looks at how social institutions where social workers practice also systematically maintain these social inequalities, such as social workers working in schools and promoting the school to prison pipeline, social workers in child protection agencies that contribute to the cultural genocide of Aboriginal and Native peoples. The structural model focuses on the elimination of these oppressions. Part of the critique of the structural model, though, is that there's too much of a focus on the political and social change and not enough on actually helping the individual. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the strengths perspective. So this is the shift from the medical model that always focuses on problems and deficits to focusing on the possibilities and strengths in an egalitarian collaborative relationship with clients. This model does not assume that the social worker is the expert with all the knowledge. Instead, social workers work to increase the potential of the environment and the human resiliency of their clients in order to help them face adversity. The downside, as you can imagine, of the strengths perspective is that it doesn't necessarily recognize that no matter how much you focus on the strengths, there's still going to be insurmountable difficulties due to structural oppression within people's lives, which is illustrated here by this comic that I quite enjoy. So for the person on the island, the boat is like a great thing, and for the person on the boat, the land is a great thing. But both of them still have the much bigger problem that they are stranded out in the middle of nowhere with no resources. So lack of resources to actually build on is the downside to the strengths perspective. And lastly, we've got the empowerment perspective. And this came about through the work of Black scholars that call for the practice that addresses power at the personal, interpersonal, and political level to try to address some of the limitations of previous theories that we've talked about. And they really talk about how the education and participation as key methods in building this capacity within individuals and communities. When they do that by developing critical awareness of the power differentials between people and to argue for the redistribution of power in society. The biggest downside of this perspective, unfortunately, is that it has been co-opted by the market and social media, and now it's very much looked at as an individual form of power, so the empowerment of individuals as opposed to the empowerment of whole groups of society for structural and political change, which has watered down the original intent and message of it.